Hi, Jean. Hi, Angela. Give everybody a second. Why does it want to keep doing this? Oh. Hi, y'all. I don't know why. Well, we got it right here. Hi, Angela. Hi, Jean. I'm up here in the Latin Quarter. Give you guys a minute to get here. Passion fruit? What is this? Let's see if it's going to let me stay. Passion fruit? Yeah, it's just yet another weird thing with YouTube. So, hi, guys. On a Sunday evening from Paris. I am just here at the Rue de Cardinal Lemoine. Angela, you're so smart. Just right off the Place de la Contrescarpe, right there. And what would today be, just a few hours ago, about 3 hours ago, on this very date, Ernest Hemingway shot himself. So July 2nd, 1961. And I'll have more on that towards the end. But I thought it would be a good day to give you a couple places in the life of old Hem, starting here in the Latin Quarter. And I'm just up here in Rue de Cardinal-Lemoine. Number 74 is where he lived. I love that there's still that sign from a travel agency that says under Hemingway there. And it is because he lived up there on the fourth floor, French fourth floor up there. And this is where he moved in on January 9th, 1960 or 1922. He came here on December 20th, 1921, so just over 100 years ago. And he came here with Hadley because they figured they were originally going to go to Italy, and they were saving money and having it changed into Italian liras. And then Sherwood Anderson actually said to him, your money would actually go farther in France. So they changed their plans, changed their everything, decided to come here instead. So they came here, got here on December 21st, arrived in Paris, and stayed at the Hotel Jacob d'Angleterre down on Rue Jacob, and had their dinner that first night at the Très Eau Claire Cafe. And then found this apartment here and moved in on January 9th. And then later that same day, they left to go skiing because they said it was so cold in Paris and rainy, they might as well go someplace that was cold and they could ski. But the reason they came here was because staying here was close to where all the expats were living in Montparnasse, but they could be a little bit farther away from them. So he never wanted to be in the middle of where everybody else was. That's where everybody else was going. He wanted to go somewhere else. Something I myself do still. As soon as something is trendy or as soon as everybody's going there, I want nothing to do with it. I love, that person's okay. Um, I love, I love time with people, but I also love time by myself. But as a researcher and a writer, your job is kind of by yourself. So I could spend time with everybody else doing chores. So it is gorgeous this week. Last Sunday, it was like 92 degrees, I think, when we were doing the walk here in Paris. Today, I don't even know what it is, but it's in the 70s, and it's perfection. Today, when I got home this afternoon, my chairs don't look so good. Um, it actually almost felt like springtime, or like those late fall days where it was still sunny out and nice. But we are gonna head around here. We are on Rue Descar. Oh my gosh, it might be the first time I've ever seen chairs out at this restaurant. See, design of its own. I don't know what it's. Hang on, we're having some technical difficulties. Okay, so right here at this restaurant, the Maison de Verlaine, is where Hemingway had rented an office. He rented a teeny tiny apartment on the very, very top floor that we can't even see. It's so far back. But it had a view of the top of the Pantheon. And he, look at how great that green door is. And he rented a teeny tiny place. It was big enough to have a tiny desk and a chair and a tiny wood fire. So it was set way up there in the back. So a whole nother level up behind that one. And this place, though, has a plaque there that says that he lived in the building from 1921 to 1925. That's not true. It was actually only from mid 1922 until the end of 1923. So don't always believe those plaques. Those plaques that are put on buildings, well, it is very difficult to get one because you have to go through a ton of rigmarole, as usual, through French bureaucracy. There is nothing about making sure that it's what it says is correct. So I don't know what this thing is doing. Hang on here. So but I see that cited all the time online. People send me things all the time when they see written about Hemingway and his Paris years. And most of the stuff is inaccurate because people follow things like those plaques, or they follow other articles that have been written that are incorrect, and then they just write about the same incorrect information. Um, Especially when it comes to when it comes to the Ritz and the famous martini story. Even Forbes, which is a pretty huge editorial publication, they even have those stories incorrect. So it kind of drives me nuts. But okay, this thing is just beeping and having a fit for some reason. So we're going to just walk down here. But the Rue Descar, that street goes down a ways from here. What is this thing trying to find? I'm trying to find its happy spot. So this is a little street I absolutely love. This is great. Come on. Hang on. Are you guys still there? I don't know what's happening. So I love this little street. This is the Rue Saint Etienne du Mont. And this is a teeny tiny street that leads to the side of Saint Etienne du Mont. Hang on. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what's happening here. Okay. So after that, so this is where Saint Etienne du Mont, and it sits right outside the church of Saint Etienne du Mont, which is also where the fantastic Midnight in Paris was filmed and where they use those exact steps. So these are the steps that they used. Looks like there's a little wedding party going on over here. Little wedding party here. The Marie of the Fifth is over here, and then of course the church. But these are the steps. I'm sure all of you have seen that, except for I have a lot of clients that I give tours to that have not been seen Midnight in Paris or Da Vinci Code, the two quintessential movies about Paris that you need to see if you're going to do a tour with me, because I reference them all the time. So this thing is not. So we're gonna pop in here for a second. As long as church isn't going on, we'll sneak in here real quick. So this is Saint Etienne du Mont, and I love coming in here because it really is one of the most beautiful churches in Paris. Because it's one of the only few remaining with the Juke screen here. Okay, we're gonna try it, guys. We'll see. If I start to lose the signal, hang on, and I'll run outside. But you can see the tube screen here, and it's absolutely amazing. And they wanted to actually tear this down. Hi, Sharon. They actually wanted to take it all out because they took all of these out in Paris. Because most of them, why this one's also different is because you could see through it. Most of them were actually a wall, and the wall was there, and the preachers would go up on top and do their sermon from up there. But then they wanted to start taking these out, and they took them out all over Paris. So Notre Dame had one, Saint Germain l'Auxerrois had them, Saint Sulpice had them, and they took them all out so the congregation could be closer to the choir. And so this one remained here because, first of all, you could see through it, but then also because it's absolutely astonishing. And it is a Juke screen or a reed screen, depending on which language you want to see it in. But it's all carved out of marble, and it's absolutely amazing. Over here, you have S and G for Saint Geneviève, because this has kind of become her church, even though it's named Saint Etienne du Mont. Saint Etienne is the first church that was on Ile de la Cité, which is where Notre Dame is, and Saint Etienne is also Saint Stephen. And then during the Revolution, they changed. So those two angels up there, they each had a piece of the Passion of the Christ, and it's one of the. And so then they changed it, so it has the laurel wreath and an olive branch. So they rubbed it out and recarved it. And then back here, we have my favorite girl, Saint Geneviève. And he has also in the church, he has this painting. This is one of the ex voto paintings. So ex and ex voto is the plaques that I'll show you some in a second, that were people buy and give to the church as a thank you for, that they were somebody in their family, a prayer was given. And this is the ex voto of the Parliament of Paris. And so you could see up there, it was given for Saint Geneviève. There's another one up here. And Saint Geneviève is here because she was kicked out of the Pantheon, which was created for her. It was created by under Louis XV, and then Louis XVI, the one who actually did it. But that's the relic of Saint Geneviève right there. And these are ex photos here on the wall. And the other day I came in here, and the first one I looked at was my birthday, which is always a sign. There's the relic, and this here in this sarcophagus is the stone that they found from next door, which is where she was buried. And they believe that is where she lay to rest because she was burned alive. And then this up here, that stained glass up there, is her story. So it starts on the left, and this is the entire story of her life. So on the left, it starts with Saint Martin, who saw her where she was living as a child and sensed that there was something special about her. The second one is when she cures her mother's blindness. That was her first miracle. The third is when Saint Germain l'Auxerrois gives her, she takes the oath and the vow to take care of the virgins of Paris. The next one is a dream that she had at the vision of heaven and hell. And then on this side, you have the first one is her giving bread because she saved the people of Paris many times. And this was when there was a siege of Paris and everything was closed and the people were starving. So she took a boat, was able to get the boat down the Seine to Brie, where they brought back bread and wheat. And then the next one is she's getting everybody to gather in prayer to get rid of Attila the Hun. And then the third one is up at Saint Denis, where they were building a cathedral dedicated to Saint Denis. And they were saying they couldn't do any work there because they couldn't see anything because the candles kept getting blown out in the wind. And she walked up, and as soon as she was there, the candles lit and stayed lit. And then the last one is her on her deathbed. If you go into the Pantheon, there's also huge murals dedicated to her and her life that tell a little bit more about those stories. But it's such a beautiful church. I love coming in this church. And every year in January should be on January 3rd, which is the feast day of Saint Geneviève. That is when they do they used to take them all the way down to Notre Dame, but they don't do that right now because Notre Dame, of course, is closed. But they take her reliquary out to the front to the parve. I love this chapel too. I love all the paintings in here. Every other church here is different in Paris, and each one is kind of special in their own little way. They took out there used to be a lot more stained glass in here, but they had taken some of it out after it was destroyed during the Revolution. Then they replaced it with just this clear glass. That's why this church has a lot of light. Other churches you go to, some of them are very, very dark. But it is a really pretty church. But then it's dedicated to so much to Saint Geneviève. And when the revolution happened, they destroyed her body and burned it 3 times, and off the Place de Hotel or the Place de Grave, which is now the Place de Hotel de Ville. And they wanted to make sure everybody would see her destroyed because her reliquary had been used for thousands of years to save Parisians and the French because they would do the huge ritual of Saint Martin. His reliquary was in Notre Dame, and they'd bring it up here, walk it up the hill. So if we go one more street, you can look down and you can see Notre Dame. He'd bring him up the hill. He'd come up here, basically knock on the door and say, "Can Saint Geneviève come out?" So Saint Geneviève's reliquary would come out, and they'd walk it all the way down the hill and take it into Notre Dame. And then they do a service in there, a mass, and then they'd bring it back and get to the edge of the island at the bridge, and Saint Martin would leave her there, and he'd stay, and then she'd come back up the hill. And there was times that there was endless rain, like months of rain, and as soon as the reliquary went back inside the rain stopped. And there was times that it was drought, and then the rains came, and there was sickness, and there was disease, and there was all sorts of things that happened. And they bring out a reliquary, and a reliquary come out, and people would touch it and be healed. You see the old girl down there, and she continued to say that. She was also, there was a piece of a reliquary inside my beloved rooster that was at the top of the spire of Notre Dame, which we would be able to see from right here. We would see the spire. And of course, that poor rooster fell to the ground. And the next day, my sweet love, Philippe Villeneuve, look at this guy. He found her in the rubble, picked her up, and it was saved. The rooster was saved. But I think that's also what saved Notre Dame from being burned to the ground, Saint Geneviève. And that's my story. I'm sticking to it. So you can see Saint Etienne du Mont. The tower on the right there, that is now the church, Henri IV, or not a church, school. But that used to be the Abbey of Saint Geneviève. So that was there first, and the building literally shared the same wall as the church. The abbey was first. It was built under Saint Clotilde, who was the wife of Clovis, who was a contemporary and friend of Saint Geneviève. Clotilde is the one who wrote her entire story and why we know all of the stories of the amazing Saint Geneviève. And so her husband Clovis died first. He was buried there at the abbey, and then Saint Geneviève died next, and she was also buried there. And then that's when Clotilde wrote all the stories, and she also became a saint too. But they ended up tearing down the church when they built this road coming through here. And so that is the Rue Clovis. But the only thing that remains of it is that tower, and is inside of that school. And I wandered in one day because the door was open, and I just thought, I'll go in there and take a look around, and got chased down by security because it's a school. But I'll try to go get in there in September. But you have a library here. This is the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève. And this was going to be about Hemingway, but now I just turned into Saint-Geneviève. But we'll get back. But this is her bibliothèque. It is also part, we are right here at the edge of the Sorbonne, University of Paris. So that is who gets to use that. You can't just go in there. That is one of the libraries that you do have to have special permission to go into. You can't go into it though that weekend in September. And by this point, every one of you should be coming that weekend in September. I think I talk about it every single week. I think Bob is coming. I don't think Bob's watching. I think Bob was coming. And here we have the Pantheon right behind me, which I'll go across the street so you get a better view of it. And this was built, of course. So Louis XV got very sick, and he was in Metz, and they had been bleeding him with leeches for days and days, which is such a weird thing that apparently they still do today, but not for everything. And he had said if he survived, he would build a church to Saint Geneviève. And so they didn't have the money. It took until Louis XVI to get it to come together. So it started being built by architect Soufflot, who the street over here is named after. So they built it, and by the time it was done, Saint Geneviève was only in there for a little under a year, because then the revolution started, and then they decided they needed a place to bury the great men of France, starting with Mirabeau, who was later kicked out of there because they found out he wasn't exactly a great man after all. So he was taken out. But it is a really great place on a hot day in Paris. It is one of the best places in Paris to go to, because it is super cool in there, especially in the basement. It's almost too cold, but it's heavenly on a hot day. So when they first moved here, Hemingway and Hadley, and they moved up here to the Latin Quarter. And at that point, it wasn't great. The Rue Mouffetard basically means the stinky street, because it did stink pretty badly. And it wasn't Place de la Contrescarpe wasn't great. There's people all the time that always say, "Oh, I'm sitting in Contrescarpe," and being Hemingway, well, he didn't like it there. He and even Hadley would write letters home saying how gross it was, and it was filled with drunks and what they call the clocher, because at night the restaurants would ring a bell, a cloche, and that would tell these people that were drunk and hungry that they could come and eat. They would throw food out to them. I was leftovers at the end of the day, and so they got to come there, and so they didn't like to sit there. So that's why he rented the tiny room around the corner, because he did need a place to sit and write. So they just went around the corner. Here's Victor Hugo. These are these great. This looks like it's been updated. It says Artist C215, and they do these. There's a whole bunch in this area that are all from people from the Pantheon, that are in the Pantheon, and then there's some other ones. There's some like in the Marais that are Jewish people and resistance fighters that died in World War II. And then on Ile Saint Louis, there's other ones. There's also other resistance fighters. And I just saw, on it, I just saw that there's one of Simone Weil, who I love, love, love. And she has been on a post box. And somebody keeps coming. Somebody keeps defacing it. Some horrible anti-Semite keeps defacing it. Simone Weil is one of the most amazing women in history. She was, she and her family were taken to a camp. Everybody in her family but her sister were killed, and she ended up coming back to be the president of the European Parliament, and also did a lot of work too for abortion rights for women and just women's issues in general. And the anniversary of her death was just recently. But I need to do a whole podcast episode about her. But she's one of those ones that I want to do it perfectly. So I just need to spend some time researching it and getting all my. I just want to cover everything. Sometimes I do people and then I learn more about them later, and then I bummed out. And maybe I should just do a part two. But same thing with Josephine. I want to do one about Josephine Beauharnais. So Rue Soufflot is this street here, and this is a perfect example of that Haussmann architecture. Oh, let's stop for some ice cream. These are all over Paris, and the salted caramel one is delicious. There's one about a few blocks away from me. So when the first time Hemingway came here, much like my own grandfather, Parker, they both first came here during the war. Hemingway's was World War One. My grandpa's was World War II. Hemingway came here when he was going to be, look at this cute little things. He was going to drive an ambulance in Italy, and they stopped in Paris for a day. And that was his very first visit to Paris and to France in 1914. And then my grandfather stopped here during World War II. So he came over in 1944, just after D-Day, as a co-pilot for B-24s for the Army Air Force, was what it was called. And then it became the Air Force while he was in there, their own branch. And he came here for a day. They went to Champagne. They came to Paris, and they went to Champagne. And I've got the coolest picture that I actually brought with me of he and four other men in their dashing uniforms drinking champagne. And my grandfather decided he wanted to come back. So they didn't actually come back for quite some time. First time they came was 1972. They missed my first birthday. How rude. But they did buy me a little dress. It says in his diary, bought Sarah. No, he called me Claudine then. Later, I decided for a very short period of time I didn't like my name because it was too different from everybody else. So my grandpa called me Sarah. And then I decided I loved my name because it was different from everybody else. But he, in his diary, it said, bought Claudine a dress and a hat, a yellow dress and a hat. He also brought back this patch that my mom sewed on my jacket, and I was very upset when I grew out of it. But I found a patch like that here since, and I keep it in my wallet. So we'll head over here in through the Luxembourg because we're not going to go over to where he lived, his other house, and we won't go to Notre Dame des Champs. But they lived up in Avocarna-le-Moine until how they got pregnant. And when how they got pregnant, they didn't think they should have the baby in France. They wanted to go back to North America. So they ended up with the help of Sylvia Beach. She gave them some money and they booked the ship back to but this time they went to Toronto. So they went to Toronto because he was working for the Toronto Star at the time. Found an apartment and signed a 1-year lease. So they didn't stay for very long. They were only there. She had the baby in October. She had the baby October, and then decided that they stayed for 2 months, and then they hated Toronto, so they left, and then they came back. Here, take me down here in case we see the baby ducks. Um, decided they hated Toronto, and they just broke the lease and came back here. And then that's when they found the apartment on Notre Dame des Champs, which is just right on the street behind Closerie de Lila, which is where a place that he loved to sit and write. And it was there. They were back for about a year. And then in March of 1925, that is when he met Pauline and Jeannie Pfeiffer. The two of them met both of the ladies. And a year later, that is when their affair began. Okay, look at the babies. Look at that. Do you see them? There's been two sets of babies. Hi, little puppies. Look at how cute they are. They just cleaned all this out. This was all empty the other day, and I was worried about the babies. Oh, that's just a pigeon. Not as cute. It's a little bluster. Oh, okay, there's one more duckies. His daughter is like, they're so boring. This water looks really gross. I hope those ducks are okay. Usually you could see, they have to clean this thing out like every other month. And they empty it and then clean it. And it's like sparkly white. And then it's like green and yucky in like a matter of like a week. Look at the cute little babies. I made them confit de canard. But Hemingway used to walk through here with Bundy, Jack, his first son, and would always say that he'd walk through here and he'd find pigeons and break their necks and toss them into the carriage and then take them back to eat. But many say, and even his own letters say that that didn't happen. But it's a good story. They just changed out all the flowers in here a couple of weeks ago. Let's see, it looks really pretty. It's a busy day in the park. But after they went, they decided to go down to the south of France. Went to the south of France where the Murphys and the Fitzgeralds and everybody were hanging out. I just noticed some of the scaffolding's down. Yay. But they're going to keep covering the next year and a half. They're going to be working on the whole facade of this building. But they went down to the south of France. And then Pauline, of course, came following along. And Pauline stayed there. At this point, Hadley knew what was going on. And Pauline was pretty horrible because she just also pretended to be Hadley's bestie while she was sleeping with her husband, chasing after her husband. And Hadley was well aware of what was going on. So they ended up, Hadley and Hemingway went together to Spain, where they were for 2.5 weeks. And on the train back to Paris, they decided to separate. So when they got to Paris, she didn't want to stay in the apartment on Notre Dame des Champs. So he rented her a hotel room for her and Jack, just right across from the Causerie des Lilas. It does not, there's no hotel there anymore. But she rented a hotel, and then he stayed in Gerald Murphy's uh, tiny studio that he had that was not too far. It was just right on the edge of the cemetery of Montparnasse. Oh, look at this! Actually, see, took some bushes down. Look at that. This is the Senate. So the Palais de Luxembourg is the Senate now, has been for quite some time. During World War II, the Nazis took it over, used it for a short period of time as a jail, but they also took over just about any good building in Paris. But Hemingway stayed there. Then it was in that September that Hadley issued the 100 days. He said, if you and Pauline could stay apart for 100 days, no talking to each other, no seeing each other, and you could do that and you still love her and you still want to be with her, then I'll give you a divorce. And so she didn't even make it 5 weeks. At the 5-week mark, she sent him a letter and said, I release you from it. I don't want anything to do with this, and I divorce you. Guess who that is? That's right, Delacroix. And so she actually released him. But that's another thing. Everybody reports on this 100-day thing. But nope, it wasn't actually 100 days. Up over here. A little workout. But he used to come through here. He'd come through the Luxembourg because he just lived around the corner. He and Pauline. I'll show you where they lived. But he would come here and he'd come down back closer to the other entrance on the Vaugirard and closer to Tournon, because that is where the Statue of Liberty was. And so there is the Statue of Liberty statue that's here in the garden that's over towards the left. That is where he would go to. So much like most people go visit their saint in a church, like I have my favorite Saint Geneviève or Jeanne d'Arc, he would come here and he would see the Statue of Liberty, and that's where he would have a little moment thinking, what should I be doing? Maybe I should just go back to the US and have this little chat with the Statue of Liberty. And then he would go on with his day. When Pauline, yeah, Hadley was a smart little cookie. Most people know uh, a lot because of that book, The Paris Wife. That is a historical fiction, so it's not completely true. The writer, while it's a really great book, she did add a lot in there, which is also why I have a huge problem with historical fiction. I actually don't read historical fiction because of the fact that it makes me crazy when they have the things that are inaccurate. But the problem is that people read that and read that. Oh, look how cute she is. Read that as it is completely 100% accurate, and it's historical fiction. She wasn't a part of it. There are parts of that book, like she suggests there was a three-way between the two women in Hemingway, and it didn't nothing like that had happened, and he was way too egotistical for that. But um, that's just always my issue with it. But then that's why everybody pretty much only knows the first two wives. They don't know the third and the fourth. The third being my favorite, Martha Gellhorn. I think she was definitely the most interesting. She had a huge career of her own. She was one of the very first female war correspondents. She was the only woman that was on the D-Day beaches during the landing because she convinced the ambulance crew that she could go. She had to hide in a bathroom of a ship to get there. And Hemingway was out in a little boat far off the coast, and he was really mad that she got to go, that she was there on the beach. And he later would retell the story that he was there, but he was not. That Martha was the best. Now the fourth one is the one I like the least. And if you listen to the podcast episode tomorrow, I talk about much more about her and a specific incident that happened with a gift that Hemingway gave to Hadley that Mary, the fourth wife, was a real pill about. So this, we're over here at Six Rue, and that up there on the top floor is where Hemingway and Pauline came and lived. And so they lived here until 1932, and they kept the apartment for another year, but they had left down to go to Key West, and because she was pregnant and had their first son, Patrick, and so she had that son actually in Kansas City, and then she came back about a year later to pack the house up and have it all shipped down to Key West. Oh, he's doing a pretty sketch of sassy piece. Because that's where we are. So Hemingway with Pauline, and then he met Martha at Sloppy Joe's at Key West. And so then he started adventuring around with Martha because she would go off to Spain, and then he would follow. And I think he loved her because she was just as brave as he was and wanted to go and chase after the action and get to the bottom of the story. And that is exactly what he didn't like once they got married, because she didn't want to stay home and be there with him and dote on him while he was writing all day. She wanted to continue to go off and write these stories. She was just really cool. She had a couple things about her that maybe weren't so great, but she just was an amazing woman that wanted to keep doing her job instead of just doting on him, which is what the other three did. Nothing wrong with that, but I just love that Martha still did her thing. She was a work correspondent for a very, very long time. She ended up getting very sick. She had ovarian cancer. She actually killed herself because she got so sick and just didn't want to live that way. And then Martha, he had so many accidents, which is what resulted in a lot of the things those last years. But Martha had heard on her way to England that he had been in a car accident, so she went to go to the hospital to see him. And that's when, he was laying in the hospital and there was bottles of booze all around his bed, and all of the guys were there and they were all yucking it up and drinking away. And that's when she was like, "That's it, I'm done with this, I'm over us," and said she wanted a divorce. And nobody left him except for Agnes at the beginning. So he hated the fact that she left him, because women didn't leave him, he left them. And he did that. I think he did that because his mother was horrible. And then Agnes broke his heart, the one he met in the hospital in Milan. And he thought they were going to get married, and she did not. But at those last few years, he, especially the year before, he started to get really, he started to have a lot of issues. And August 4th, 1960 was the last time he came and visited Paris. So he visited Paris every couple years. He would come usually on his way to when he was going down to Italy or Spain, or especially when he was going down to Africa to do safaris, he would come through Paris. And he'd come to Paris and he'd sometimes be here for a week or two, or sometimes even up to a month. And a lot of times in those later years, because he could afford it now, he'd actually would stay at the Ritz. And so his very last time he was here was August 4th, 1960, which was a little less than a year before he died, just about 11 months. And he was just here for a few days. And then in that August, he was here in France, and then he was down in Spain. And he was writing letters saying that he was having these like panic attacks, and he was having a hard time remembering things. And then he got back, he went back. And then on November 30th, went and checked into the Mayo Clinic. And at the Mayo Clinic, he was there for hypertension. He had an enlarged liver. He had a whole plethora of issues. And then in December of 1960 is when they started doing electric shock therapy on him. During this time, this is when he was finishing up what he called his Paris sketches. We know that as a Moveable Feast, but he did it at that time. He didn't name the book, and that was named after he died. But he was working on these while he was at the Mayo Clinic, and a gentleman named A.E. Hotchner was a good friend of his. And especially those last few years, Hotchner was really an integral part when Hemingway started to get he was just having a lot of issues, and that's because he was in so many different car accidents and a plane crash. His first one was on November 1st in 1930. He was in another one in May 24th in 1944. That was the one in London when Martha saw him. He just a few months later, on August 5th, it crashed his Jeep and hit his head on a giant boulder, and he was having double vision, having all these issues. That happened in France. And then on June 20th, 1945, in Florida, when he was driving Mary to the airport, he was in another accident, and this one really caused a lot of issues. And then he had a plane crash on January 23rd, 1954. That was in Africa, and it was actually reported all over in the papers that he was killed in this accident. So he was not killed in that accident, but all of these things brought a lot of brain damage, the concussions and everything to his head. And then you also bring in those years and years of drinking. Everybody says is that when a big drinker he was, but he wasn't actually in those first years of Paris. He wasn't drinking like everybody thought he was. Those later years when he got older, and I think a lot of it was because he was having all these issues. So he just kind of wanted to forget about that. So that's when he really was drinking a lot. I mean, he could drink so many daiquiris in just one sitting. It was just horrible. So that story from the Ritz of him drinking 51 martinis, it was not him. It was him and about 12 other guys that drank 51 martinis. But he probably could drink at least 10 or 12 of those, which I think if I had two, I would be dead. But he had a lot of these issues, and so it just was one thing after another. So he started having he wrote this he wrote this column for Cosmopolitan magazine, and Cosmopolitan magazine back then was very different from the Cosmo we know today. That's even still printed. I don't even know, but he wrote this article for them, and it was something like 50,000 words or some crazy amount that's way more than an article. And they contacted him and said, "You need to pare this down. It needs to be shorter." And he was like, I can't do it. So he had called Hotchner, and Hotchner flew down to Cuba to see him and worked with him on condensing this, because he was like, I can't do it. I don't know where to start. I can't even do it. So he was really having a whole lot of issues. He was becoming very paranoid. He thought, while everything was going on in Cuba with Castro, and he would take his boat, the Pilar, out, and he would say that he would see like submarines and all these other things. And he would say that he thought J. Edgar Hoover was following him, and they were tracking him, and that he would see them off the coast with binoculars, and everybody thought he was crazy. And no, sure enough, later we find out, many, many years later, that yes, J. Edgar Hoover was actually following him and watching him, and there were people spying on him. So that wasn't completely that delusional, but at the time, they all thought he was kind of crazy. So he was just having a whole lot of issues. And just the fact that he couldn't write, I mean, that's what he did. That's what he's known by. That's what he's still known today for. And he couldn't do that. He was having huge problems with that. So that just added to him kind of spiraling and going to this really, really huge depression. And Hotchner, he did a really fantastic book, Hemingway in Love, that he published after. Look at this guy just got a La Crusade Dutch oven. Hi, sir, I love you. Um, and he wrote this book called The Hemingway in Love, and it came out after Mary, the horrible fourth wife, died. And it's really good. But he wrote another one, and he actually recorded conversations on tape that he had had with Hemingway. And so I think that he really is one of the really good authorities on that. Michael Richardson's also written a bunch of books about Hemingway. But I have, there's a lot of things, dates and some things in there that have, since he wrote it, I think they found out. Um, the dates are off a little. Going through, there's also the famous story of Hadley losing all the manuscripts, and then in Moveable Feast, he writes that he left immediately and came back to Paris to see if that was true. But that's, even though Hadley or Hemingway wrote that in Moveable Feast, he didn't actually come back for about 2 months. So and that's because we know that because of the letters that he saved. But Hotchner was with him, and he it was a really great authority on all of that at the time. And so he went to the Mayo Clinic, and while he was there, he was actually working on the Paris sketches. On January 22nd, 1961, he returned back to Idaho. In March, he started getting, writing that he was getting really depressed again. On April 21st, 1961, was his first attempt at trying to kill himself, and Mary found him and stopped him. 2 days later, on April 23rd, he tried again with a shotgun. And so she called in a panic to the doctor. And when they took him on this tiny plane, they were going to check him back into the Mayo Clinic. And when they're standing there, he tried to walk into a propeller and tried to kill himself a third time. Um, on the 25th of April, 1961, he returned to the Mayo Clinic for more rounds of electric shock therapy. And it was there that Hotchner came to visit him. And he said that he was working on the last chapter, rewriting the last chapter of Moveable Feast. He had actually taken these sketches and actually sent them to Scribner's, who was his publisher at the time, and they had sent it back with notes. So while most people say none of this was published before, it was actually in the process, and then the first draft of it had gone to Scribner. So that is why there's a special edition you need to make sure you read. If you read that book again, but he convinced them that he was doing just fine, and Hotchner came to see him, and he had told him that, and but he said he was redoing this last chapter because, and if you read it, if you have it with you when we get done today, go back and read the last chapter, or even just download it on Kindle and read it, and know that when you read it and it talks about Paris and it talks about how he loved it, he's not actually talking about Paris. He's actually talking about Hadley, the first wife, that I think was his great love of his life. But I don't think he would have become the person that he did if he hadn't had left Hadley, because Pauline's money is what got him going off and doing these bullfights and everything else. So he became kind of this larger than life character. And all of them, everybody plays a role in your life to become who you are, good or bad. But the final chapter of the book, when I learned all that and I reread it years ago, I just reread it and started crying. It's just heartbreaking. But he convinced everybody on June 26th that he was fine, and he left by car, and drove all the way from Minnesota to Idaho, and he got there on June 30th. And on July 2nd at 7:30 in the morning, 62 years ago today, Mary was left the key to the gun cabinet, which was right on their back porch. She just left the key sitting on top of it instead of locking it away, which, if he'd already tried twice to kill himself, why would you just leave the key sitting on top? And he got out the shotgun at 7:30 in the morning and killed himself. And this time did it. So she later said for a long time that it was, he didn't mean to do it, and he was cleaning the gun, and it was an accident. And it took her actually quite a few years before she would admit that he did actually kill himself. There were some of the pieces of the Paris sketch that were still in his typewriter that was there in Ketchum, Idaho, and it was Hotchner that helped talk to her about what to do with those, and then she worked it out with a editor at Scribner, and she actually kind of edited it and took some things out to kind of make it that he was kind of looked a little bit like a jerk, especially when the stories about Fitzgerald. She had it kind of edited that he looked, that he was kind of this real bully jerk to him. And then she also edited some of the stuff about Hadley and Pauline. She actually took out some of the nicer things that he said, real loving and beautiful things he said about Hadley. She took those things out. But if you do read it, read the restored edition. I think it came out about 12 years ago. I have it if you go to my website, claudiahemingway.com, and go to La Boutique. The one that I have listed in there with that, the cover is the one that is restored edition, and it's really great because it has all of his actual, what he wanted each chapter to be, and it talks about the things that were changed in there, and it's really, really great. But he also did not want to have his letters published. He specifically said not to publish his letters, and he was a pack rat, and she did have send all those off to be published, which we could actually be thankful for, because that is where we actually find out about a lot of these stories. And Cambridge is done 5 editions now. I think they're going to do 13 or 14 in all. The 5th one goes up to, I think it's 1932. They're fascinating. They're absolutely amazing the way that they did these books. And they have letters, and then they take the letters and go into great detail, and do research within the letter of saying stuff about letters he had to his family and where his parents were staying. And his mom was, in Nantucket for the summer with his sisters, and it's really interesting, and that's where you kind of get the other truer parts of the stories. But it's a really cool thing if you wanted to check those out. But it is pretty sad. 62 years ago, it was a very long time ago, and that was before he died. He died a year before Sylvia Beach died, who was his great friend here in Paris. And then that was 2 years after she died that that Whitman took her shop's name and redid his bookshop to Shakespeare and Company. But I've already ruined enough of the stories that you thought you knew about today. So that is but check out tomorrow on the podcast. I share some of more of that, and then also a very specific story of something that has to do with Hadley and Hemingway and Mary, and then something that I actually got to see when I was in DC. So check that out. But we are here at San CP, so this is where
he wrote a Moveable Feast, and he came in here because he was having problems in the bedroom with Pauline, and, living out the street. And she said, you should go to the church and pray to a saint, because that always helps me. And so he writes in Moveable Feast that he did. And he came here and he prayed to a saint. He doesn't say where, which chapel, but he prayed to the saint. And then he ran home, and Pauline was waiting for him in bed, and he was victorious and conquering as soon as he got back. But that story actually happened in Key West. So it didn't actually happen here, because I found that out because I was looking exhaustively for hours and hours and days to figure out which chapel in Sanso Police he came to, so I could hope it was, Son Joan of Arc. And then that's when I realized that he actually said that actually happened in Key West. So, but thank you guys so much for joining me today. I don't know if I could see any other comments on here. But thanks, guys. Angela and Jean and Sharon and everybody else that's there. I just see those names here in the comments. But make sure you guys give it a little like, because that helps when it gets replayed. And if you are a Patreon member, you can see this. Of course, I have the link is still private for you guys for another week, and then after that, I do it open up to the public. But thank you guys so much. Thanks, Sharon and Angela, for joining today. And now I get to go home and record some more podcasts for you guys. But here they're doing this big. They have this set up here until I think it comes down soon. Usually is a thing here, but they've been doing a different thing every week. So it's thanks, Leslie. They had a book fair here a few weeks ago, and then it was antiques. But they are today was supposed to be this weekend is a special like little Bucaniste fair. And so this morning I ran out and walked all the way from one end to the other on both sides of the river. And of course it was at like 11:15, and most of the Bucanese were closed. But I did find this magazine that had something about this one painting I've written back, the Watteau, that was stolen from the Louvre, and that was on the cover of it, and I was super excited. It was a magazine from 1939, but it is also because yesterday the Tour de France started, and everything's out of whack for me because I used to love to get up in the morning at like 3 a.m. on the West Coast and watch it live. Well, now it's on in the afternoon here, so it starts at like 11 a.m. French time. And so now I'm pretty much for the next 3 weeks going to try to, if I'm not with clients, be home every afternoon so I could watch it. So I have to go because it's just ending, and I've got to go home so I can watch the last few minutes. But it'll be here in Paris in 3 weeks from today. I may or may not do the live that day because I'm going to be watching it, and maybe I'll go live and just do a little thing so you guys could see some of it for a little bit. But I'll be so excited, and it's like a major bucket list of mine to get to see the Tour de France. And so I might just need to be present and be able to enjoy it and have their sweaty bodies flying past me on the Champs-Elysees. Or maybe not right on the Champs, but I kind of want to be there right at the edge of the Louvre so I can see them in the Louvre together 8 times as they go around. Wouldn't that be a dream? So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful Sunday, and I hope you guys don't have any storms there. It is perfect. If so the rest of the summer could stay this temperature like this, I'd be extremely happy. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining, and I will see you next week. And make sure you listen to the podcast tomorrow, because I'll share the little story about one more story about how horrible Hemingway's fourth wife, Mary, was. All right, guys. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.